Hi there. I think we're getting started now. So, welcome back to the final Monday session of the London Conference 2020. I'm Kate Spiliopoulos, Head of Events at Centre for London. If you are following the discussion online, please use the hashtag LUNCONF20. That's LONCONF 20 to follow what other people are saying and so they can find your tweets. If you're in the Zoom webinar with us this evening, please use the Q&A function to submit questions for Professor Glaeser after his speech. It should be at the menu at the bottom of your screen. And while you're in there, you can also upvote other people's questions that you think are particularly good. So last spring, at the start of the pandemic, there were a lot of comment pieces and hand-wringing going around about the death of the city and the increasing digitization of all of our lifestyles. And I think a lot of urbanists said that this was overblown because, of course, that's what we would say. But I think it is true, it's evident, definitely, that cities need to adapt to a whole different set of changing global circumstances, as noted in our session this morning and in the London at a Crossroads report. 2021 is going to be the 10th anniversary of the publication of Edward Glaeser's Triumph of the City. And as such, we're so pleased to have him here with us this evening, or afternoon for him because he's calling in from the States. Later on, we're going to be joined by urbanist Kat Hanna to moderate the Q&A and manage any questions that you might have for Professor Glaeser. But right now, it's my honor to welcome to the London Conference stage, Professor Ed Glaeser.
Thank you, Kate. And it's great to be back with Centre for London, if only virtually. I am very grateful to the connections that I've made with the Centre for the event that they hosted for Triumph of the City a decade ago. And I think it is wonderful and important that we can connect with each other in this particularly critical moment for our urban world. Now, for most of the past decade, including probably that first presentation I gave on Triumph at the Centre for London 10 years ago, I would have emphasized some very positive things about cities in our current world, in the world before COVID. I would have mentioned the fact that there's a very strong relationship between population density. For at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. What this shows across all of Europe's NUTS 3 regions, it shows the relationship between population density and GDP per capita. And of course, this is before Brexit data. So incomes are twice as high in the most dense areas of the EU relative to the least dense. This is something economists call agglomeration economies. The fact that we generally get more productive by being enmeshed in a maelstrom of economic activity. The red line shows the relationship between population growth and density. As you can see, that is also sloping up. So whereas historically, Americans at the start of the 19th century left their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboards to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, we were, instead of spreading out, we were clustering in. Within cities too, and certainly you see this in London, again, pre-COVID, there's an enormous price tilt that favors the urban core. This uses US data using from Zillow. It shows the price growth between 1997 and 2015 by distance to the urban center, distance to the central business district or CBD. And as you can see, the price growth is much higher in the urban core than it is on the urban periphery, which reflects both the advantages of working in the city, but also the enduring demand for cities as places of pleasure as well. When I come back to the future of the city post-COVID, I will tend to emphasize that I have the most confidence in the enduring ability of cities to survive based on the human desire just to be with other human beings. Of course, the most amazing things that are happening in cities are happening in the developing world. This shows the share of countries in different income brackets that are more than 1/3 urban. In 1960 and today, income is, of course, adjusted for inflation. What this shows you is that sort of in countries with between $4,000 and $5,000 or $3,000 and $4,000, those were about 80%, 90% urban, or 90% of those countries were more than 1/3 urban in 1960. 90% of those countries are more than 1/3 urban today. But go down to the poorest countries in the world, those countries with per capita incomes below $1,000. Those places, it's a very easy number to remember what share of those countries were more than 1/3 urban in 1960. The number was 0. Right? Because in 1960, as had been true throughout almost all of recorded history, to be poor was to be rural. Today, more than 40% of the poorest countries in the world are more than 1/3 urban. And you see the rise of megacities in places like Kinshasa and Karachi that are both poor and too often poorly governed. Also, you can see the large gap in this group as well, from 20% more than 1/3 urban to 60% more than 1/3 urban. Now, while there are many demons of density, many downsides of people living close to one another, crime, traffic congestion, and of course, as we've just been reminded, the terrors of contagious disease, on net, at least prior to COVID-19, people who lived in the poor cities of the world generally were happier than rural dwellers. This shows the gap, this data is somewhat old, between 2005 and 2007, between self-reported life satisfaction or happiness between the people who live in cities and the people who live in rural areas. So you can see here that in the rich parts of the world, there's really not much difference. The United Kingdom is right here. The urbanites are just so slightly happier. In Sweden, the cities enjoy a larger edge. In Italy and New Zealand, it's the rural dwellers who say that they're happier. But go to the poorest places in the world, India, in my data, India, Mali, Rwanda, Ghana, Moldova. In those areas, it is the city dwellers who all have a strong happiness gap. And I think if we think forward to a world post-COVID, the progress of poor world urbanization is very unlikely to be stopped by this, because in fact, the death rates from COVID are still only a tiny fraction of what the death rates were, let's say, from cholera in the 19th century. And poor farmers still came to cities despite that. So the sort of poverty makes cities continue to be a draw even in the presence of disease. Now, one of the reasons why the COVID-19 pandemic seemed so scary is that there were discontents with urbanization before that. And I'm just going to highlight 3 of them. The past 5 years have been difficult years for cities, both because of data, because of political challenges. And I just want to highlight 3 of them. This is in the US. This is much more of an American fact than it is a UK fact. The left side shows the relationship between productivity, per capita GDP, and urban density. Again, strong positive effect. The right side, however, shows upward mobility. So this is how rich you end up as an adult if you're a child of a poor parent in cities. And here you can see that those children growing up in denser cities did worse rather than better as adults. So even though cities are forges of human capital for grown-ups, people who come to cities like London see their wages go up, not immediately, but month by month, year by year, which is most compatible with a view that we're getting smart by being around other smart people. By contrast, the children who are growing up in frequently highly segregated neighborhoods and going to under-functioning New York or American urban public schools end up doing far worse. So our cities are too often failing our kids. Second point is, of course, the urban affordability problem. This is something, of course, London shares with New York and San Francisco. Ultimately, this is about the supply of housing. Affordability crises occur when you don't build enough to actually supply the demand. And what you can see in this graph is that along the x-axis, along the horizontal axis, is the amount of new construction. Along the y-axis is the difference between price and construction cost. So it's how much more it costs to buy a house than it costs to build a house. And as you can see here, in the US, the places that build a lot, with names like Austin and Raleigh and Las Vegas, aren't expensive. And the places that are expensive, San Francisco, Honolulu, Washington, New York, don't build a lot. There's no repealing the laws of supply and demand. And one of the sidelights, of course, of making it so difficult to build and facing these rising prices is that rich people start moving into formerly poor neighborhoods, which creates the battles over gentrification that have existed throughout the world. Finally, of course, and we have experienced this acutely after the killing of George Floyd, there's the anger over urban policing. This is an earlier protest in Baltimore, but there's a feeling in which we may have reduced urban crime levels, but we did so in a way that imposed massive costs, particularly on African Americans living in cities. And again, this is an added challenge that cities are facing going into COVID-19. Now, this picture is often taken to be somehow or other reminiscent of the plague of Athens, which is our first recorded urban plague. It's actually a biblical plague. It's by Poussin. But the plague of Athens is a good place to start when we think about the long history of cities and plagues. The story behind the plague of Athens is that this was at the very start of the Peloponnesian War. Pericles' strategy was he was going to summon his allies and his local farmers inside the walls of Athens, rely on their protection against the Spartan land army, and send out the Athenian fleet to harass the shores of the Peloponnese. Totally sensible, reasonable military strategy. The walls did, in fact, keep the Spartan hoplites out, but they did not keep out the bacteria that came in through the port of Piraeus, right? That bacteria spread. It killed perhaps a quarter of the population of the city. It killed Pericles himself. It may have even killed Herodotus, according to some accounts. Thucydides was there to describe it and describes a city that sort of had gone mad. And in some sense, the most glorious epoch in classical Athens ended in the deaths of that plague. The city did survive. It did survive for another decades, continuing to fight against Sparta, but it never really was the same. And this place that had given us history, philosophy, art, democracy itself really was laid low after this plague. And this has continued through history. Often the ability of cities to withstand plague depends upon how resilient their institutions are at the beginning, at the start. So, for example, probably the most devastating plague is the plague of Justinian that struck Constantinople in 541 BC. This was a moment at which the Mediterranean world hung on the edge of a precipice. Justinian was sending out his warlord Belisarius to try and reimpose the Pax Romana on the Mediterranean world, right? And there really was a chance that it could have happened. And yet the plague itself, Yersinia pestis, made its first appearance on European shores in 541 AD, CE, and completely derailed Justinian's attempt to do this. The outcome was maybe 8 centuries of rural poverty and political chaos. This is about the most terrible thing that you can imagine doing with a plague, but the reason was that it sort of hit Europe at its most vulnerable moment. Of course, the plagues that have come since 1350, when Yersinia pestis made its second appearance, have never had impacts that were that devastating. By and large, our institutions have proven to be much more resilient. Our cities have proven to be much more resilient. And I put this graph up here, which just shows death rates in New York over the past 200 years, to remind ourselves, to remind all of us that, in fact, the last century has been a peculiarly blessed century in the history of cities, right? Throughout almost all of history prior to 1920, cities were killing fields. A boy born in New York City in 1900 could expect to live 7 years less than a boy born in rural America. That was about the same life expectancy gap that existed between Shakespeare's London and the rest of Elizabethan England. Right? You can see the contagious diseases that came into cities and then were spread by urban density throughout the 19th century. The yellow fever epidemics, which raged during the first 3 decades of the 19th century. This is a mosquito-borne plague that came in through the Caribbean, probably originally from Africa. And then, of course, you have cholera. Waterborne, coming out of the Ganges Delta, carried into New York probably from Ireland in 1831. But all of Europe's cities are devastated by cholera. Eventually, they figure out the waterborne. Dr. John Snow, of course, in 1854, figures out the waterborne nature of it. But for decades, we're flying blind about even what the cause of it is. Interestingly, many of the public health innovations that came from cholera came from a mistake. There were 2 large-scale medical hypotheses at the start of the 19th century about the causes of these diseases, one of which emphasized the contagion aspect, the other which emphasized miasma, which was the unhealthy soil. Now, the contagion people pushed quarantines, which weren't actually that effective against these diseases, partially because the mosquitoes perhaps could fly from the boats onto the shore, partially because the mosquitoes had already infected the land. The miasma theorists, who got the science completely wrong, got the public health pretty right, because they argued getting rid of stagnant pools, pumping in cleaner water from outside the city, in general trying to clean up the area, which, even though they didn't really understand what was going on, did end up making the cities healthier. New York's infrastructure, like, for example, Central Park or the Croton Aqueduct, which opened in 1842, are an example of this. And indeed, when we think about what we will have to spend to make sure that COVID-19 is a one-off, it's worthwhile remembering just how much we spent in the 19th century to make our cities livable. America's cities and towns were spending as much on water and sanitation at the start of the 20th century as our national government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. And it's not just about infrastructure. You can see the Croton Aqueduct is opened in 1842, and New York continues to have cholera pandemics for another quarter century. It's only when you have the Board of Health, which starts imposing penalties on tenement owners, on property owners who don't connect to the water system, that you solve the last mile problem. And really that becomes a critical part of making the city livable, because before that, the connections were expensive. Poor people didn't want to pay for that cost. They didn't connect, and they still got cholera. Now, flip forward to our current world. And in some sense, this just shows data from cell phones. It shows the shutdown of mobility.
We seem to have lost Professor Glaeser for the moment. If you just bear with us while we try and work out this technical difficulty.
Am I connected again? Can someone confirm?
Yes, I can hear you. You're back.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. My internet was broken. There was a whole power outage in my house. It's the wind that I had mentioned earlier, so I apologize about that. I should be able to come back normally, but I had been showing maybe someone. I'm sorry about the delay on this. Maybe someone can show the.
You were just after the slide about yellow fever and diseases in New York, and you were onto the slide going on about mobility, comparing Italy and Germany and a few other countries.
Yep. Okay, let me see if I can rejoin from my computer too, which will make things easier. Again, the virtual world is imperfect, just to highlight it. Well, the first slide that I was just showing was about the radical deurbanization of the world, which is, after all, what social distancing is. We have moved from being constantly connected to isolating ourselves. And if cities are the absence of physical space, then this deurbanizing is, in some sense, undoing that.
Okay. All right. Now, and that's exactly what this is showing here. So we're showing the reduction in mobility. This is just to retail and recreation that has come post-COVID. Now, in the early days, at least, COVID, like many of these plagues, seemed to be a particularly urban event. That's partially because cities are the nodes that connect our urban world, right? So disease came into the US or came into the UK via London, via New York. And then, of course, the dense corridors of these cities enabled the disease to spread. So this was in May. This shows the relationship between density across America's cities and the level of COVID-19. That has decreased over much of the past 2 months. The disease has been disproportionately rural in the US. proving that, of course, you can still get the disease as long as you connect with other people. This shows the relationship as of June between the share of population living in a favela, which is a high density or informal settlement in Brazil, and COVID. Again, a strong positive relationship. And this is from the work of Sam Asher and Paul Novosad, showing the relationship between infections and the population living in slums in India. Again, population density making it easier for it to spread. Now, one of the challenges, of course, of enabling our cities to come back is the fact that they are so dependent upon public transportation. And the rise of COVID made lots of people terrified of getting into a train, getting into a bus. This is a Massachusetts poll as of May. 80% of survey respondents said they were uncomfortable riding buses, subways, or commuter trains thanks to COVID. This shows the reduction in ridership of the MBTA after COVID, and this shows the same reduction in transit across lots of different countries. So again, transit declining is a huge problem. We have relatively little evidence on whether or not transit itself spreads COVID, but of course we have strong evidence suggests that moving around, at least during the months of April and May, was strongly associated with the spread of the disease. So these are the 5 boroughs of New York City. The left side shows the number of cases per capita. The right side shows a change in the number of trips as measured by cellular phone data. I could show you the same graph using the public transit turnstiles data, so how often people were taking public transit in those areas. As you can see, the places where you had the sharpest reduction in the number of trips, this was typically from places that were richer and so had people who were able to adjust their work habits. Those had the fewest number of cases. The places where the cases were most prevalent had poorer workers, had workers who were in essential industries, and those were the areas in which the spread was higher. Typically, we estimate that a 10% reduction in trips in this period was associated with a 20% reduction in disease. So in fact, it's quite a strong relationship. Of course, this was before all Americans were wearing masks, so it wasn't completely clear how that matters today. This, of course, has not just been a health crisis, it has been a massive employment crisis, where we have seen in the US recession, levels of unemployment not seen since the Great Depression. In some sense, the evolution of our urban world has made us maximally vulnerable to this pandemic. If you think about the arc from farm to factory to urban service workers, right? For many people in London, as well as in Boston or New York, the ability to serve a latte with a smile provided, right, a source of employment that wasn't going to be outsourced, that wasn't going to be automated. The fact that human beings are willing to pay for a pleasant interaction in an urban service job, enabled millions of people with less formal training to still find their way in the world. 32 million Americans before COVID-19 worked in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade. But these professions are both vulnerable to actually catching the disease, but even more so to being shut down as soon as that smile becomes a source of fear rather than a source of pleasure. This just shows the changing employment patterns, the declining number between 2000 and 2020 of employees in manufacturing, the rising number of people in leisure and hospitality, and this is in retail trade. The 2 higher clusters, these are professional and business services. These are the highly skilled workers who are still zooming their way to employment. And the top is education and health services. These are typically government employed workers. Many of them still go to work. Many of them were at risk, but typically they kept their jobs. One way of thinking about this is prior to COVID-19, I was frightened of the fact that so many Americans, so many prime-aged American males seem to be not working. The share of prime-aged men who was not working increased from 5% in 1967 to 15% over much of the past decade. You see similar numbers in parts of the UK as well. Of course, this is not spatially neutral, right? You see the sort of large swath of joblessness in America's eastern heartland, which starts down in Louisiana and Mississippi, goes up through Appalachia and ends up in Rust Belt cities. One way to think about that was those workers were not ones who could benefit from the urban service economy. There were not those jobs serving coffee in West Virginia. And in some sense, the fear is that if pandemic shuts down these urban service jobs, that all of America, all of the world becomes a bit like West Virginia in terms of its job prospects. Together with a series of co-authors, Zoe Cullen, Chris Stanton, Mike Luca, we've been measuring the evolution of America's small business ecosystem after COVID-19. This was an early shot about April 1st, 2020. This just shows the share of businesses that were closed, about 45% in our overall sample, but with a fair amount of range. High-end businesses like banking and finance, only about 20% were shut down. Personal services, arts and entertainment, 70%, 80% shut down. And somewhat terrifyingly, a very large share of them also expected to be closed in December. So 37% of them expected to be closed. And when we think about the post-COVID world, one of the most important things is to make sure that when these businesses do close, and many of them will, even with large-scale government largesse, we make sure that we have regulations that make it easy to start new businesses. Of course, one of the reasons they're shutting is they're expecting huge reductions in demand to persist. And of course, that's what we've seen. That's what just this thing is showing. So I will end by just discussing briefly, will the boost in remote working become permanent after COVID? It feels like I have been having the discussion, a debate about whether or not new technology will make face-to-face interactions and the cities that enable those interactions for 30 years in my life. Certainly that Alvin Toffler in the third wave predicted that new forms of technology would make cities obsolete. And it seems like we're experiencing that now, but let's have a little bit of perspective. Over the course of history, there is a dance between centrifugal technologies that push us apart and centripetal technologies that pull us together. The 19th century, with its streetcars and underground and elevators and skyscrapers, was a centripetal technology in which cities grew great. The 20th century, with its cars and radios and TVs, was a centrifugal century in which people dispersed them from one another. But even though these technologies killed off older forms of urban manufacturing, and I'm just showing an image of New York City's garment industry, which was the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s, and it was largely killed off by globalization and new technologies. Toffler predicted that these kinds of information technology would kill off the urban information industries, would kill off urban finance or management consulting or all these other jobs that continue to thrive. And yet for 40 years, it seemed that he was wrong. And it seemed that this is an image of Mike Bloomberg's office at Bloomberg City Hall, which emphasizes the advantages of face-to-face connection. This is, Google's campus. You'd think if technology was making face-to-face contact obsolete, that of all the companies in the world who would send everyone home, it would be Google. And yet, at least prior to COVID-19, they didn't do that. They said, come together. This is how creativity works. This is how connection works, is the ability to connect people with one another in physical space, not just in virtual space. Now, of course, we've experienced this massive drop in attending work. We are, for those of us who are lucky to be able to still work, we're working virtually. That switch to virtual work has been very unequal in the population. 50 million Americans in May had lost their jobs due to COVID. 50% Americans were teleworking due to COVID. What this just shows is that the share that are teleworking is really dependent on education. 70% of Americans who had advanced degrees were teleworking. Only 13% of them had lost their jobs, as opposed to less than a high school diploma. You have 20% had lost their jobs and only 5% were teleworking. A virtual world is not a world that is compatible with the least fortunate and least educated people. We polled businesses about what share of them expected their workers to go back to work, or how much of them expected their workers to go back to work. We got that 40% or more of firms, this is from here, expected that 40% or more of workers who had switched to remote work would stay remote working, okay? This is from this alignable network of small businesses. When we polled larger businesses through the National Association of Business Economists, we had a slightly smaller share. So about 36% said that 40% or more of their workers who switched would stay switched. So this is a change of about between 5 and 10% of American employment. If it's right, okay, it would be a substantial shift, but not a shift which I think is completely catastrophic, partially because we haven't seen a large uptake in the number of new hires that are remote. This looks at employment for non-remotable jobs and remotable jobs, okay? Remotable is defined by these measures that are put together by Jonathan Dingle. And so non-remotable jobs, you saw employment drop, that's in the blue line. You saw postings drop, but the postings are back up. Here you see employment, which hasn't dropped for remotable jobs, but postings have killed, which sort of suggests that while employers have taken their existing employees and moved them to remote, they're not eager to bring new workers on board if everything's going to be via Zoom. They're not actually opening those jobs. So there's been a big drop in the number of hires in these remotable firms. And that ultimately lies, and I'll just end with this, behind my crystal ball. So to the extent to which it's worth anything, I tend to think about the world as having two different paths. The first of which is fairly catastrophic, which is the world, if the pandemic lasts for 3 or 4 more years, if we get a second pandemic in the next decade, then really quite significant changes will appear in both urban location and the demand for urban transportation. This really will be a radically different world, and it'll be a catastrophic world for face-to-face connection and for retail, trade, and leisure and hospitality. I think this outcome is sufficiently catastrophic that our governments will actually spend whatever it takes to make sure that this doesn't happen. That this is this will require tens of billions of dollars to prevent future communicable disease outbreaks. But it is worthwhile spending tens of billions of dollars to save the trillions that have been lost due to this pandemic. So I think that will not happen, but it is there as a terrible warning for us. Let this not be something that we ignore and think that we can just go on as before. Now, even if the pandemic ends, we are still going to have a tough 5 years for cities, and there will still be relocations, dislocations. But I believe that ultimately our species is an urban species. We get smart by being around other smart people. Cities enable those connections. They enable creativity and they enable fun. So what are the changes that I think will occur? I think that prices for urban real estate will drop. One of the reasons why you're not going to have massive vacancies in a city like London, of course, is that the prices will drop a bit. So consequently, you'll have some young businesses replace old businesses. You have huge ongoing demand. I mean, before this crisis, we were all worried about affordability. So there's more demand for residential space. Perhaps some commercial space will move to residential space. Younger workers will replace older workers, younger workers who are less afraid of going on public transit, less afraid of being in cities. International travel will be depressed. And of course, London is a great hub of the globe. But nonetheless, even though the sort of ability to connect across space may be reduced, the desire to be around other people will go on. And I think I want to just end with this point. If you think about the two things that cities do that are really important, one of which is they enable these chains of collaborative creativity that have powered humanity's greatest hits since Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner. I think that will be depressed in a world that is totally virtual, but I can't be totally confident about it. We may still manage to be creative, even if we're living this way. But there's a second thing that I know is not the same, which is the emotional connection of being with someone is lost. That's important in terms of the joys of city living. And we saw this in how quickly young people rushed to be back living their life live as soon as there were any breaks in the regulations that enabled them to do this. But it's also true in the workplace. If you think about what technology companies did pre-COVID to get their workers excited about working, it was by making work fun. It was about the football tables, the foosball tables that existed. It was about creating an environment that was sort of an emotionally binding thing. And just from a personal note, I lecture almost every day of my life, and I have no idea how to get young people excited about doing economics virtually. The face-to-face magic of lecturing is lost. We are ultimately a social species. We're ultimately a species that evolved for face-to-face connection. And for that reason, I believe that ultimately cities will come back. They will survive. They will continue to be just as vibrant and as important as they always were. But we're going to have a tough few years, and we really are going to need to spend in a smart way to make sure that this pandemic does not happen again for another century. So let me stop there. Thank you I'm sorry I ran over a little bit, but I had to make up for my technological problems previously.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Ed. So just to recap, my name's Kat Hanna. I'm just going to be chairing the Q&A for the next 15 minutes or so. Please do post any questions you have in the Q&A box that we've got going on Zoom. And I think if you're also using Twitter, they're going to be monitored on there as well. I'm going to, I guess, take the chance firstly, again, to thank Ed. And I think I probably am not alone when I say there, as someone who's had a few sleepless nights, I think, thinking about, the future of cities, I think there is no better company to be in during what feels like a bit of an existential crisis, both as kind of an urbanist and someone who cares about the future of cities. And I'm sure, Centre for London are very much included among that. One of the questions I wanted to begin with is, I guess, looking back to your previous book, Triumph of the City, which kind of highlighted some of the factors that might determine a city's success. So, for example, around talent, before we mentioned governance. And it would be good to have your thoughts. What are some of the factors that may determine how well or how quickly cities are able to recover, or perhaps may not recover post-COVID?
I think fun becomes even more important. I think if you think about the enduring anchor, we've now discovered that we can we can have routine meetings over this thing. We can sort of make our day-to-day business go along. But all of us, right, the whole world is feeling like we've missed a major part of our life, which is sort of connecting with other human beings. the sort of ability of cities to engender the joy in life is really critical. And let me be more concrete about that. If you think about a tech worker who's now been made footloose, at least for the next couple of years, from Google or Amazon or whoever's told that tech worker that she can go remote, what's she going to do? Well, she may very well decide she wants to leave San Francisco. The place is expensive. It's kind of dysfunctional in lots of different ways. But where's she going to go? Is she going to move to a wheat field in Iowa and buy a huge unlikely. She's going to want to go to a nice city, to a medium-sized city, to a place perhaps where, there's still fun, it's still exciting, to a Vale, to a Boulder, to, I don't know, a Bristol perhaps in the UK, to some place that is actually a thriving consumer city. So I think those places are going to do well. Now, London is, of course, as fun a place as there is in the world to be most of the time. So that is, of course, a great London asset. But that's I think, sort of the consumer side of the city, the pleasure side of the city really becomes paramount in a world in which workers are increasingly footloose.
Brilliant. And I think just returning back to the points you mentioned really at the beginning of your presentation, where you obviously highlighted that, agglomeration does have some disadvantages, and particularly, that we associate with kind of some of the really thorny urban issues, whether that's around congestion, urban inequality, unequal access to open space, a lot of these disadvantages that I think have really been thrown into relief, actually, by coronavirus. I guess if I was to appeal to the optimist in you, and I think there definitely is one that's come across in the talk you've just given, are there any potential upsides? I know we've talked about the affordability side of things, but what are some of the opportunities that you think, a post-COVID city could try and seize?
So certainly I am happy about the possibility of some cities becoming a little bit cheaper. I'm happy about the idea that sort of younger urbanites can actually afford cities a bit more. That's good. There is certainly a lesson of this, that we are all in an urban species and we're in this together, that a pandemic that starts in Wuhan can lay the whole world low. I hope the lesson is learned from this, that we all have a stake in the sewers of Africa or India. And I hope that we recognize that, investments that are being made in the developing world really are of first order interest to us. And I hope that that's something that we learn. I think more generally, you can imagine a world in which that understanding of a common community isn't just true across the planet, but it's also true within our cities. This was certainly true in the 19th century, that since rich people got sick because of poor people, there was more of an investment in infrastructure for poor people. We've seen less of that. If anything, it's gone the other way. That in fact, the rich people have introduced the illness into cities this time around, and then infected poor people who have then taken care of it. But you'd hope that would create some scope for recognizing the common humanity and the need to invest in, better schools that bring more opportunity, or rules that make sure that it's easier to become an entrepreneur in a lower income area. So I think those are the things that certainly I hope for as a result of this. And I certainly hope that we all recognize that we need politics that is both full of optimism and hope, but also one that is sort of rigorous about making the investments that we need to make sure that our planet is less vulnerable in the future. Yeah.
And I think probably going back to that point about politics and thinking about the ways, different groups, different classes essentially have been impacted by coronavirus. We've talked, and in my world in particular, I know there's a lot of conversation about the future of the office, but we see actually, firstly, the remote working trend is incredibly new. I think, that's one, I think the most kind of interesting stat I've read, recently is that pre-COVID, only 1 in 3 British people had ever worked from home. So, we are very much at the beginning of this remote work experience. So I think there's that side. We've also then talked a bit about those who've been made unemployed and what structurally that could mean, particularly in politics. But what actually about those people who still do need to go to work, to be in a physical place, and don't have maybe either the kind of labor mobility or the ability just to, relocate to a nice place in the countryside? What does the future of their city look like if they're staying put?
I think it's and that is tens and tens of millions of people, right, that are not going to, and we saw this in the data about less educated. 5% of Americans who have less than a high school diploma were able to telework. Those just jobs are not ones that can be made remotable. I think you're looking for a future that's like West Virginia. It's a future that is either one in which they are jobless because those urban service jobs has disappeared, or they have, they have been allowed to flourish in an urban service economy because the city has become safe again. It is those people that make it clear that if we want a world that is not dystopian. I mean, I have always pushed back on the notion that prior to COVID-19, we should just accept the idea that technology would make work disappear. Right. When you look at the lives of the long-term jobless, right, these are not lives that are, anything but miserable. And it's not just about money. I mean, the impact of money on happiness is much less than the sense of connection, the sense of purpose that comes from employment, right? And we cannot accept a world in which tens of millions of people, either in the UK or the US, are jobless. And that requires, I don't see any future for them other than these urban service jobs, which requires that our cities become safe again.
Interesting. And I'm sure we could talk about, if that doesn't happen, what are some of the measures that could be put in place. Much as I'd love to continue asking my own questions of Ed, I am going to look to the audience and some of the contributions that we've had raised. And I think one in particular is just unpacking, obviously we've talked about the city as a whole, but actually think about how we break down the impact on different parts of the city. So the CBD, the central business district in particular. So, for cities like London, and this was a question, raised by Alan Jones, who's president of REBA, really looking at what does a CBD start looking like? Is there an opportunity to move towards, for example, a more mixed use model, or potentially repurposing some existing office buildings, for example?
So I think that there's also potential upside. I think many of us have thought that mixed use was a great thing long before COVID-19. Decreased demand for office space will surely lead the property markets to want to push to using that space, to renting it for someone, and that will push for more mixed use, right? Unquestionably. And I certainly remain enormously optimistic about the desire of people to live in urban areas, to live next to each other, even if their jobs have become remote. I mean, one of the biggest phenomenon over the past 40 years has been the rise of reverse commuting. Right? If you're a sort of young American who has a job in a suburban office park in 2005, you didn't want to live there. You wanted to live in New York or live in Boston and commute out. That hasn't changed. And so I think that's exactly the same point. I really want to agree with the thrust of this comment. This is a great time to reimagine the connection between work and living together. We need to ask ourselves what regulations make it difficult to make things mixed use. This is a great time for us to sort of tear down the barriers to using space in new and creative ways, just as it's a great time for us to tear down the barriers to new entrepreneurship. But I very much agree with the sentiment of that question.
And I think, picking up on that point, you mentioned, the kind of trend of people maybe living in particularly, I think this is probably more of a US model of, living in a more of a city center and commuting out to a suburb. And I think there is a concern if we look at actually what some of these trends could mean, I guess, for sustainability and also, for transport as well. So, we've had a lot of questions asking about what does all this mean for sustainability? You flagged, for example, people being resistant to use public transport. You also flagged, a decline in air travel. So on balance, I guess, what are the trade-offs with that alongside an economic recovery as well?
So you're right. So from air travel, we probably get less emissions, and certainly in the short run, emissions are down. I agree with those who fear that even if we are traveling less internally, if we're traveling all by private vehicle, this could be worse in terms of congestion, and it could be worse in terms of air pollution. So it's also true that our whole transit systems were built to handle large numbers of riders. The current model of sort of American trains, which are going out with one person in each carriage, that is so far from being not just environmentally unsustainable, but financially unsustainable, that we really do need to, if these systems are going to continue, we really do need to imagine a world in which we've managed to make the transit system safe again. We've convinced people that transit systems are safe again. Otherwise, I think it's a disaster, both in terms of sustainability and traffic congestion. There is a thought among some that we can, convert ourselves to living in a tiny neighborhood and thus avoid all of that stuff. Well, I think it's great to imagine more mixed use. The overall trend over the past 300 years has all been completely the opposite direction. right? There's a world in which, if you think back to London in 1740, you lived in a sort of small, particularly if you were a poorer urbanite, you lived in a smaller area and you walked around a little bit. The course of the past 250 years is we had first the early public transit innovations like horse-drawn omnibuses to the underground. It's all been a world about sort of the entire city is your playground, and people like that. I mean, it's one of the great joys of London is that it has an archipelago of neighborhoods and that you can sample from all of them. So I think the idea that we're going to somehow revert back to thinking that our small villages are like a great outcome, at least it doesn't sound like it's going to be all that sustainable in terms of what people actually want to do, nor does it seem like it's a recipe against pandemic on its own. It's not like you can really effectively create a quarantine about, your 15-minute cordon that protects things.
Yeah, well, you go. You've actually unknowingly answered one of the questions we had, which was, what are your thoughts on the kind of 15-minute city? I think it's been growing a lot of traction here. I think it kind of began particularly talked about in Paris, but have been a lot of discussions in London as well. And it's clear you see it not necessarily as the panacea. I think
that is certainly true, Kat. But I want to say, most of the 15-minute city is not done by government regulation. It's just by people who are trying things out. And I am in favor of all forms of innovation and experiment in this type of area. So I'm not an enemy of the 15-minute city. I just am skeptical that this is going to be a widespread solution for much. But.
Brilliant. And there's quite a few questions we've also had as well, particularly looking at the impacts on young people. One thing you mentioned is, again, what is it you miss out on, when working remotely? Again, challenges, for example, around taking on new hires. And I think a lot of people have said, it's younger people who particularly suffer, for example, from not being in the office environment. We've also got, if we're talking about those who are even younger, how their schooling and education has been impacted. So do you have any thoughts in particular, given the emphasis that, in all your literature and your work, you place on the importance of kind of human capital and skilling, about how we really make sure that it's not young people who bear the brunt of this crisis?
You're absolutely right, and I think it is a catastrophe for the young in both in terms of the education side and in terms of just the joy of life. I mean, I have 3 children who are roughly teenage, and it's one thing for a mid-50-something man who's pretty happy reading books and working on economic research to survive this. Although even for me, this is pretty hellacious. But for a 15-year-old who was looking forward to having like a normal life, or at least some of the added responsibilities of young adulthood were mixed off with the greater freedom and the greater pleasures that also come with being slightly older, you're getting all the responsibility, none of the joy. And even those places where we are actually making schoolwork, it's still not fun the way that it used to. And for much of the world, we're not managing to make schoolwork. That in fact, vast numbers of our citizens, our very young people, are not able to get remote working to work. They're just not dialing it in at all. We're losing human capital in a massive way. And so I think this is absolutely a human tragedy that comes from this. And it's yet another reason to make sure this never happens again, is because this is a huge cost that's imposed on our younger citizens.
I think you're muted there, Kat. If you could just unmute yourself.
There we go. Is that working now?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, it's a bit of a slow response. Going back to this point really about the nature again of relationships between city centres and suburbs, and what that might mean as well around commuting patterns. I mean, can you see, for instance, that we might move towards more polycentric cities, so moving away from this model of everyone coming inwards? And again, we've talked about what that might mean for the city centre and for the CBD and how it might reinvent itself. But actually, what might it mean for a suburb, those areas that have previously been dormitories, but actually over the past 8 months or so have found themselves kind of more active than ever?
I think there's probably some demand for more suburban office space. I think that's probably right, particularly in high functioning metropolitan areas. If particularly for older workers, for well-established businesses, probably a bit of demand. And also, of course, there's this countervailing force in terms of wanting more space per worker. I would guess that that's a relatively short-term event. I mean, again, we're assuming that by 3 or 4 years from now, we're through the pandemic, we've made the investments, and we've started to forget about it. So I would guess that that's not a long-term thing. But in the short term, sure, I think you'd expect to see a boost in demand for suburban real estate. The thing where I expect to see more of a change is if you think about people moving to the mid-sized cities that are intrinsically attractive. Those areas I would suspect would get more office space as well, even if the first people who are there are telecommuters who are, you know, dialing it into their San Francisco colleagues. Like over time, you know, maybe Google decides to put a little more office space in Vail if they have a large enough community of workers who are in Vail so they can connect face to face. So those areas, the sort of high consumption values places I expect would benefit, will gain more office space as well.
Brilliant. And I guess final question, we have run over slightly, I think, just due to the technical hitch earlier, which I guess is, you know, given your experience, you know, particularly in the US, what has struck you, I guess, from how various cities have responded so far in terms of mitigating the most negative impacts of coronavirus? Are there any particularly important lessons we should learn?
I think it's still hard to be particularly confident about this. I think look, I mean, in terms of management, what we know is good is not going in thinking you know the answers to everything. So Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand has been the sort of global heroine on this. And it's not so much that New Zealand thought that they knew all the right answers going in, but they were heroes partially because they measured so assiduously. They took these, you know, when they went in the harsh lockdown, they took the regular testing of the asymptomatic, and so they knew the prevalence of the disease in their population. This enabled them to decide when it was safe to open things up. If you only test the symptomatic, you have no idea how much of the disease is running around. And so the American Sun Belt, which, you know, was the sort of epicenter of the explosion over the summer, you know, they had relatively few diseases, and though they decided it was safe to open up. They opened up again immediately, and all of a sudden young people ran out. Who wouldn't blame them? They were desperate to get out. It was putting a huge cost on them, but of course it wasn't safe for them to get out, and the disease spread like wildfire. And so it just reminds us the places that are good understand that you've got to constantly be learning about this disease and constantly be on the move for striking back against it. You've also got to be nimble in terms of allowing businesses to change their model, to allow them to do more outside dining, and again, to do more to test whether or not it's actually working. So we really can't, you know, have an arrogant approach to this. This is a changing and difficult situation. We need to continue to learn, and we need to continue to experiment and learn around those experiments. Cities are good at that. They've always been good at that. Cities are machines for us to get smart by being around other human beings. They will persist. They will continue to thrive. But it's been a tough year, and it's going to be a tough couple of years going forward.
Brilliant. Well, I'd just like to thank you so much, Ed, for your time, for joining us. And I think what has been both a really kind of thorough but clearly set out, you know, talk through some of the main issues and I guess decisions that are facing us as we go ahead. I think picking up on your point about, you know, the importance of constant learning, you know, I think there'll be no better place to learn over the next few days from the following conversations that are going to be going on at Centre for London at this year's conference. I'd refer people actually just to the wealth of, you know, comments, questions, reading resources that are available in the Q&A. So, you know, this is no doubt very much the beginning of a conversation. I'm sure, Ed, we will be reading some various pieces from you and hearing from you at other talks in the near future. But it just remains for me to thank you very much again for your time and for your consideration this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Centre for London.
Yes, thank you, both of you. That was a wonderful session. Really, really enjoyed it. And thank you also to our sponsors of the London Conference 2020, the Corporation of the City of London, L&Q, Uber, London Councils, the London Legacy Development Corporation, London Property Alliance, the Greater London Authority, Primera, Trust for London, Commonplace, and the Port of London Authority.